Good morning, friends. Mark Milwee, Trinity, Alabama, Mountain View Baptist Church. Today we want to continue our journey through the Bible with a lesson I've entitled, Why I Am a Calminian. I think some of you might find this interesting. For a number of years now, the subject of Calvinism has been a hot topic in our Southern Baptist Convention. The primary reason for this discussion is the fact that many years ago, Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, hired Dr. Al Mohler, and he's been churning out a new generation of Calvinists that have fanned out across our convention. And as a result, this issue has been put on the front burner of many of our churches. Additionally, many Christians, especially young Christians, have been drawn to the teaching of John Piper and Tim Keller, who both come out of a Presbyterian background, which, of course, is based on Calvinism. So lots of books have been written for and against this subject in recent years, and much of the discussion is centered around our text this morning. Now, I'll just say right up front, I am certainly not an expert on this subject. As indicated by this story a few years ago, George Mladen was our pianist for our senior adult choir that we had there at the church in San Diego. And I love George and his wife, just a wonderful, godly Christian people. And he was a retired Presbyterian minister. And so one time, George asked me, he said, well, Mark, what's your position on Calvinism? And I tried to sound smart, and I said, well, George, I don't really hold to all 6 tenets of Calvinism. And he looked at me for just a minute and he said, well, Mark, there's really only 5. He said, I'm sure you're familiar with the TULIP acronym. And of course, I was, but I forgot about it. So I said, well, obviously, I'm not a Calvinist. I don't even know how many petals are on the tulip. But anyway, we'll talk about what that means in just a minute. But I want to give you a basic overview from our text this morning about what I feel the Bible teaches on this topic. And I want to walk us through what I'm calling the steps of salvation from God's perspective. God's up in heaven. He sees the beginning from the end. We just see what's right in front of us. And so let's take a look at salvation from God's perspective. And let's begin with our text. It's Romans 8:29 and 30. It says, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. Robert Mounts, in the New American Commentary, describes these verses by saying, in this 5-word golden chain, we have a summary of all Christian doctrine. Well, the 5 words that he's referring to there are foreknew, predestined, called, justified, and glorified. John MacArthur, in his commentary in Romans, points out that all these words are connected with the words he also, indicating that God is in control of the process from the beginning to the end. However, the struggle many people have with these 2 verses is the conflict between God's sovereignty and man's free will. For instance, if God determined ahead of time who would be saved and who would not, then where does that leave us in the process? I mean, are we just pawns in this cosmic chess game of life, or do we really have a choice in determining our eternal destiny? Well, these are the questions that Bible scholars have been wrestling with, not just for years, but for centuries. And I'm going to try to answer a few of these questions today. However, I want to say again, as we begin, that good Christian people disagree on how to interpret these verses. In fact, let me show you a little pastor humor here. Hold this up where you can see it. I hope I can get it close enough. And that might be backwards on your screen. I'm sorry, I forgot to do the thing. But anyway, let me tell you what it says. Okay? There's a caption below the cartoon, and it says, a Calvinist and an Arminian square off. So you see the 2 guys getting into it there. The Calvinist is saying, I'm starting to feel like it's meant for me to deck you. And the Arminian is saying back to him, oh yeah, well, whatever you choose to do, buddy. Now, that might not be funny at all to you, but let me tell you why that's funny to pastors and folks who study these things. Calvinists derived their name from the teachings of John Calvin. John Calvin strongly believed in predestination. That's why the Calvinist guy in the cartoon is saying, I'm starting to feel like it's meant for me to deck you. You sometimes hear people say, well, I'm a 5-point Calvinist. This means that the person adheres to the 5 points that John Calvin taught, and these are summarized with the acronym TULIP, T-U-L-I-P. I wrote it out for you here, and again, this may be backwards on your video. I apologize for that. But the T stands for total depravity, or that men and women are totally sinful. We'd all agree with that. The Bible says all have sinned, fallen short of the glory of God. The U stands for unconditional election, or some say unconditional predestination, which means that God has already determined ahead of time who will go to heaven, who will go to hell. The L stands for limited atonement, meaning that Jesus only died for the elect. I stands for irresistible grace, which means that man is saved by the will of God without choice. And then finally, P stands for perseverance or the saints, or that those who are predestined for salvation cannot be lost. John Calvin founded, or maybe I should say his followers founded what's today the Presbyterian Church. So if you have Presbyterian friends, they adhere to, most of them at least, adhere to Calvinism. I would say probably all. And I did mention earlier, there's a strong movement in our Southern Baptist Convention trying, in their words, to bring Calvinism back to the convention. Now, in opposition to Calvinism, we have the teachings of James Arminius. James Arminius was a popular pastor in Amsterdam who worked diligently to confront the teachings of Calvinism. He died in 1609, but his teaching was popularized by John Wesley in the 18th century. Now, I told you people have been debating these things for a long time. Arminius strongly believed in free will. This is why the Arminian guy in the cartoon said, oh yeah, whatever you choose to do, buddy. Arminius was basically the anti-tulip. He did believe in total depravity. However, he did not believe in unconditional election or predestination. He said that election was conditioned by response. In other words, God makes salvation available, and it's up to us whether or not we accept or reject it. He believed in unlimited atonement, meaning that Jesus died for everyone, not just for the elect or for those chosen beforehand. He also believed in what he called resistible grace. Calvin taught that God made grace so attractive that you just couldn't resist it. But Arminius insisted that we must have a choice. And then finally, Arminius believed that you could fall away or that you could lose your salvation. Well, of course, John Wesley was the founder of what's today the Methodist Church, and most traditional Methodists would lean toward Arminianism. So as a general rule, though, most Baptists fall somewhere in between these two positions. This is what led Dr. Leo Garrett, the former distinguished professor of theology that died in 2020 from Southwestern Seminary. He coined the phrase Calminian to describe what most Baptists have traditionally been. That's why I gave my message title, Why I Am a Calminian. We tend to agree with Calvin about total depravity, or that all are sinful. We also, majority, tend to agree with perseverance of the saints, or once saved, always saved. You can't lose your salvation. But most of us like to think that we have a choice. So we lean toward Arminius that election is conditioned by response, that grace is unlimited, and that grace can be resisted. I personally like the words of Baptist statesman John Leland. He lived a long time ago, but this is what he said about the debate. He said, the best theology provided enough Calvinism to believe that a man was lost, and enough Arminianism to believe that he could be saved. In an interview recently, or a few years ago now, with Dr. David Allen and Dr. Steve Lemke, following the publication of their book, Whosoever Will, the subtitle, A Biblical Critique of 5-Point Calvinism, this is what they say. They say many wrongly assume that there are only two theological positions on these issues, Calvinism and Arminianism. They say this is far too simplistic. In fact, most Baptists are neither Calvinists nor Arminians, but would better be called Calminians, using Dr. Garrett's term, in that they affirm some aspects of each theological tradition. So where does all this come from? Well, one of the key passages that proponents use to debate these issues is our text today, specifically verses 29 and 30. So let's read them one more time. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn from among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. Bible scholars are quick to point out that all five of these key words are in the aorist tense, which means they are a completed action. Now, again, remember the five words are foreknew, predestined, called, justified, and glorified. So let's dig in and see what we can discover today about the meaning of these words. First, God's foreknowledge. The Bible is clear that God knew ahead of time who would be saved. I mean, this should be obvious from the fact that God is omniscient. This means that God knows everything. God knows everything in the past. God knows everything in the present. God knows everything in the future. Therefore, it should come as a surprise to no one that God knew from the beginning of time who would be saved. So this leads some to ask, well, if God knew ahead of time then who was going to be saved and who was going to be lost, why did he not just create people who would be saved? Why would he create anybody that would be lost? Well, it all goes back to free will. If God only created beings that were made or forced to love him, then that really would not be love. We would be doing it out of some kind of mechanical obedience rather than by choice. A.W. Tozer, in his book Knowledge of the Holy, he tries to reconcile these two, God's sovereignty and man's free will, by writing this, and maybe you might find this helpful. He says, an ocean liner leaves New York bound for Liverpool. Its destination has been determined by the proper authorities. Nothing can change it. This is at least a faint picture of God's sovereignty. On board the liner are scores of passengers. They're not in chains. Neither are their activities determined by degree. They are completely free to move about as they will. They eat, sleep, play, lounge about on the deck, read, talk, do whatever they please. But all the while, the great liner is carrying them steadily on toward a predetermined port. Both freedom and sovereignty are present here, and they do not contradict. So he summarizes by saying, so it is, I believe, with man's freedom and the sovereignty of God. The mighty liner of God's sovereignty God's sovereign design keeps its steady course over the sea of history. So maybe you find that helpful, I don't know, but the Bible teaches that God is sovereign and God is in control and God is omniscient. He does know everything. So he foreknew, he knew ahead of time who was going to be saved and who would not. This leads directly then from the second step of salvation from God's perspective, and it's predestination. Now look at verse 29. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. Now, the word predestined literally means to appoint beforehand. It can also mean predetermined. Therefore, predetermined simply means to determine beforehand. God has already decided or determined something to be true about believers before it takes place. So what is it? What has God predetermined or predestined to be true from all Christians? Now, this is where good Christians disagree. Our text says God predestined us to be conformed to the image of his Son. In other words, God has determined ahead of time that Christians will be like Jesus no matter what. This means we will share his character and share in his glory. However, not everyone agrees with that interpretation. A Calvinist, of course, would say, look at this verse and say, well, it's obvious. This verse is talking about how that God predetermines ahead of time who will be saved and who will be lost. But is this really what this passage teaches? If you look at it in context, then I believe we must conclude that what is predetermined here is that true believers will be conformed to the image of God's Son. I would argue that this passage is not talking about whether or not people will be saved, but about the fact that those who are saved will be conformed to the image of His Son. In fact, somebody said, if you just look up the word predestined or election in the Bible, you can make a strong case for Calvinism. But in determining your theology, you need not just look at those verses, but at the entire Bible, not just a select few. The Bible is filled with invitations for people to follow Jesus. It's filled with stories of people who are called to make a decision to trust Christ. It's filled with instructions about going out into the fields and reaching people for Christ. I mean, if all of this is predetermined ahead of time, then why does the Bible include all these passages about going and reaping and sowing, including the Great Commission of Jesus, His final words to us, where He tells us to go and make disciples of all nations? I'm personally not a Calvinist because I believe that we have to have a free will. We have to be free to choose whether or not we're going to receive or reject Christ. That's basically where I stand on the subject. But this leads to the third step, which is God's call. Look at verse 30 again. And those whom He predestined, He also called. Sometimes we act as though we are the ones responsible for everything. We get so focused on our struggles or successes that we focus on the fact that we forget about the fact that it's God who began a good work in us, and it's God who will complete it. God predestined us to be like Jesus. God called us into relationship with Him. So God takes the initiative. God makes salvation possible. I mean, He sent His one and only Son, Jesus Christ, to die on a cruel cross just so that we could be saved. God does the calling, but we have to respond. We see this dramatically in the life of Jeremiah when he was a young man, in the life of Samuel when he was a young boy, in the life of Isaiah when he had his vision in the temple, and of course Paul on the Damascus Road. All these men responded to the call of God upon their lives. And we all have similar stories to share, how that God got our attention and we made that commitment to give our lives to Him. So God calls us out to be His children. But then this leads to step number 4, which is justification. And those whom He predestined, He also called, and those whom He called, He also justified. Justification is the process by which we are declared just before God. Paul has already spent a great amount of time in this book talking about how this takes place, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it this morning, but basically, God forgives our sin because we have put our faith and trust in His one and only Son, Jesus Christ. He has accepted the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross as payment for our sin, and now we have been set free from the bondage of sin and death. This is why there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, as this chapter begins by saying. This then brings us to the final step of salvation from God's perspective, which is glorification. Look one final time at verse 30. It says, and those whom He predestined, He also called. And those whom He called, He also justified. And those whom He justified, He also glorified. Somebody called this verse the most daring verse in the Bible. They called it that because it's speaking of something that will happen in the future as a completed action. This verse declares that we have been glorified already, but technically this is something that can't happen until we go to be with the Lord. This illustrates that from start to finish, our salvation is in God's hands. Our future is not in our hands, it's in God's hands. Our future is guaranteed because God is working in us. Our future is so certain, the Bible speaks of our future glorification in the past tense. So these are the steps of salvation as seen from God's perspective in heaven. Foreknowledge, predestination, calling, justification, and glorification. God is in control from beginning to end. We're fulfilling His plan. We're living our life according to His purpose. So, is all of this predetermined ahead of time? Well, our Calvinist friends would say, well, yes, of course. But many others would argue and say, no, we must have a choice. Calvinists would argue that God's grace is so irresistible that we can't help but say yes. But others would argue that if we can't say no, then it's really not a choice at all. Whichever side of the fence you fall upon, understand and know this. Our eternity is hanging in the balance. Everybody agrees in total depravity, that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Therefore, all are in need of a Savior. So I pray you'll choose wisely, because no matter where you stand on these issues, Jesus died for you, he loves you, and wants to have a relationship with you. Well, God bless you. Thank you for watching this morning.